Hi, folks. Welcome. You're joining us to talk about adapting intelligence techniques through uncertainties for the CI Fellows May webinar. And with us today, we've got our fellows ready to share with you our observations and our experiences through our current wave of uncertainties, but also grounded in really decades of experience in these sorts of things, having seen some disruptions throughout our recent history and around the world. And so a little bit of a word about the fellows. So we are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to support the profession of competitive intelligence and related practices. And we support practitioners in various aspects of what practitioners do, from the commercial nonprofit to educational establishments. And through our ACME mission as ambassadors, champions, mentors, and educators, we offer programming like this. And we have members from fellows from around the globe. And we will soon be putting out a call for nominations for new fellows for this year. So please stay tuned for that. Our nomination process for fellows will be beginning. And so with that, we have CI fellows on our webinar. So today we'll be joined by Dr. Brad Ashton. I'm Cynthia Cheng, Correia, President of the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows. We'll have Claudia Clayton, Dr. Craig Fleisher, who's our VP, and Arik Johnson, Clifford Kalb, Madureira, and Ellen Naylor, and Dr. Michael Neugarten, and Parmalee Usman, I think, has also joined us if I had seen her. And so with today, we are continuing our discussion from March, since this crisis had begun, to help intelligence practitioners adapt to new practices, adapt to the uncertainties of this new environment. And it's become quite clear for all of us that these uncertainties will be continuing and on a global basis for the foreseeable future. And as such, we feel it's really important to create a supportive environment where we can share ideas, insights, best practices, and also help you keep your pulse on what is happening in CI practices, because things are happening very quickly. And so it's particularly important that as we do so, we're not simply training our sites on foresight, but we're also maintaining situational awareness as things are rapidly evolving. So with that, I feel that it's appropriate to start with this quote from President Eisenhower. And most of you have seen the portion in orange. But I think that what's important is what follows, which often is left out. And so the context. And so the idea here is, and we've highlighted some of this in bold too, right? If you haven't been planning, then you can't start to work intelligently, at least. And also part of planning, while we may not carry out the plan as we've planned it, is to keep ourselves steeped in the character of the problem so that you may one day be called upon to solve, or to help solve. We're in this now. And while we're not necessarily an emergency situation in most cases, this is certainly at the point of crisis, and for some more than others. So with that, I want to just open this up and have fellows talk about adapting the scope of our intelligence practices, looking at the nature of our service and our value, accuracy, speed, and costs that are associated with the work that we do now, our sources and method, project management, user relations, technology, basically everything Intel. So the way we've structured this as for those of you who've joined us, we have Q&As. And so please post your Q&As in the chat and also in the questions panel as well. And share with us what your thoughts are, and you can help guide this discussion along with our panelists who are in place. So with that, let me just take a step back and see, which fellows have some burning thoughts that you would like to share regarding these, because some of you are in the front lines of this actually as advisors and insights creators and so forth. And so we want to be sure that that we're able to share through this medium and elsewhere. So anyone who wants to take this? Yeah.
I'll go ahead and start if that's all right, Cynthia.
Always.
Thanks. So I'll just note that when this pandemic actually began, as we might expect, despite the fact that some businesses had pandemic-related plans in place, but not a lot of them. I should be fair about that. And the ones that actually had those, the vast majority of which had to do with the last SARS that we experienced, over 10 years ago. And many of those that I saw, and again, keep in mind a very small number, probably about 3 standard deviations out from the mean. Even of those, most of those hadn't been updated in a few years. And this was another one of those examples where a lack of advanced planning, as I went back to your Eisenhower quotes right there at the beginning, I think caused a lot of problem. There's an old saying in the crisis management field that, issues that are ignored are crises invited. And I think that's a lot of what we've seen happen. So and I'll stop here, but there's been an immense amount of change. I think a lot of organizations, especially businesses, started this off on their back foot. Some of them actually still are on their back foot. And as we look ahead, which is where a lot of us in the intelligence world like to do, we look ahead and around corners and over horizons. I see a lot of companies that are reopening and restarting, restarting their economies, but they're still not ready for the second wave, the next flare up, the next big peak. Even though they're starting to pay that lip service, it's got to go beyond lip service. And I think we have a huge role to play in bringing some execution level, tactical, operational level kind of intelligence to bear on helping them make those adjustments they're going to have to make.
And Craig, wouldn't you say then, that it's particularly important for us, to really maintain a couple of positions in our mindset. Right? We've got to maintain that future orientation as we are also grounded in that situation awareness and find a way. And it requires a lot of adaptation. Right? Many of us have experienced, agile, right? But this is not agile necessarily, right? Because this is actually something that is much greater in scope than that. And while agile practices can help with this type of adaptation we're talking about requires additional skills and experience, right? Would you like to share some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, there's an old saying that, agile can also be fragile. And I think we have to be pretty careful in this, in this time. But there are places, and I know I've had conversations with some of the fellow participants on the webinar about this probably within the last month. There is a place for agile and other kinds of, fast moving, problem solving techniques to be adapted here. And I've seen some of them used well and effectively. Having said that, when you're in the midst of a crisis, you don't have the time frame that you normally have to do what you normally want to do. And you're forced to make decisions. You're forced to solve problems under a gun, so to speak. And this one kind of an invisible gun that might be fully loaded, and it's kind of aimed at your business's heart and head, and that's not a good thing. So, this is not a time, if companies aren't used to applying agile to intelligence, for example, this is not the time to start that kind of experimentation and journey. For those that are already using it well, they need to use more of it. And I guess I'll just summarize, we need to use what we use well and draw on those wells for now. And then we're going to probably be forced by necessity to innovate across some of our approaches. And I see a lot of the intelligence approaches being used by folks that we work with that are being adapted readily. But again, you don't want to make big bets with things that you've had no demonstrated background using before this.
Absolutely. One of the things that we've been talking about in some of my training in consulting circles is the idea of the incremental shifts, right, in adaptation, as well as you expand your adaptation muscle in some cases, so that you can continue to maintain situational awareness. Because if we were to jump into innovation, we're losing a lot more control. And that is one thing that we can't sacrifice here. So any other thoughts from our fellows on the panel about some of this, these broader dynamics before we drill down into more of the specifics in adapting practices?
This Cliff, let me jump in on the aspect that you have up on the screen, which might be a good starting point from my experience. And that's the one of user relations. I think everything starts there. if it turns out that your relationship has been one of a long-term nature.
Cliff, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt and mention that you are cutting in and out. So I don't know.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
much better. Yes.
Yeah. The user relations aspect was what I was focusing in on. I think if you're used to dealing with clients who are strategically oriented, and the work you're doing is planning over the next several years or several even decades, that kind of goes out the window now, particularly if the organization you're dealing with is small. If they're small and they're coming to the stage in this pandemic where they've got to come back into the, reopen their businesses, their issue is survival. And if survival is the one thing that you need to focus on, it's very short term. And the issues that you'll have to deal with will be very tactical, which may be different. And so I think the starting point should be, even if your traditional relationship with the user has been only to work on strategic projects, start with a conversation about are your decisions that you need to make over the next week, over the next 3 weeks, over the next 5 weeks, over the next quarter. And if so, let's map out a program together that gives you a sense of what we can do in that time frame and how we can help. And even for people who enjoy the process of receiving a variety of options for decisions, et cetera, may change their decision-making style in a setting like this. They may say, just give me one recommendation and give it to me fast. Don't give me all the detail. And I think at the end of the day, if you jump into an adapted style of delivery without having that discussion with the user before you start, you could go down the wrong road.
Excellent advice, Cliff. And what I'm hearing what you say too is that we really, this is a really important time for us to reassess intelligence needs and intelligence styles and so forth. And this is a great time, I think, to turn to Jonathan Dunnett's question. Well, we have you here, Cliff. He says, curious on what you're seeing from leaders out there in terms of understanding. Despite the pandemic, are leaders buying into both what the pain of now feels like and what this will feel like when the next crisis comes? Are they being responsive and proactive to mitigate future pain?
Okay, let me respond to that. A lot of it determines on how accountable they are for producing results. If it turns out that they're evaluated on the basis of their performance over a year, the answer is no. If it turns out that they're evaluated by speaking before an investment community every 3 months, the answer is yes. So I think it turns out that you need to evaluate the scope of the decision, the timing of the decision, and whether or not the person who's in the role, who's making the decision, has an attachment to his position, his job. His job may be at risk. So a lot of it has to do with whether or not decisions that you have to communicate on and make decisions on are linked to the performance of the business and the accountability of the customer.
Now, what are your thoughts, also about the decision makers' blind spots, right? Because if you have a decision maker who, regardless of whether or not one's role is at risk, who harbors blind spots, you are in the position as the intel professional internally, to ideally be able to advise on that, to be able to help course correct, to be able to nudge and suggest that there might be some gaps there and some alternative ways of seeing the external environment and the dynamics. So any thoughts from our fellows about that role, about how we might be able to use these vulnerabilities, if you will, to the advantage of the intelligence practice within the organization, right? These are opportunities for us to heighten our performance, to be more visible and so forth. Any thoughts about that?
Hi, Cynthia.
Yes, Luis.
Yeah,
Hi.
what, I can add
You
something,
want to
Cynthia.
go?
Oh, yes, do you want to take it, Luis, and then we'll go to Brad?
No, just go to Brad.
Yeah,
Oh,
go
okay,
ahead.
sure. Yeah, hi, Brad.
Hello.
You're on.
I simply wanted to point out that, you know, like many people, my focus right now is that business is really going down. I just read an article from the Economist Intelligence Unit. They expect Q2 to be down over 9% globally. And so you know, that's the environment we're now in. And that's a very scary environment. Not only are companies struggling to stay alive, but they're certainly going to have trouble growing and maybe even entering new markets. And so I think from the standpoint of intelligence, I think Cliff made the point earlier, we need to focus and pay close attention to our customers to make sure what we're doing is highly relevant to what their needs are. Because it's just definitely a tough time for many businesses out there, as you well know.
Yeah, and right now, risk mitigation, right, as we're looking at those numbers coming down in future quarters, right, is a real priority for a lot of our users. And
Yep.
this speaks to what Cliff was saying about strategic versus tactical and so forth. And that 9% figure that you mentioned is global, but there are going to be some economies that are going to take much bigger hits, right?
That's right. That's exactly right.
So, you know, this is the type of thing that we need to understand in terms of our situational awareness on the macro level, but also, you know, locally and in a micro level, internally to our own organization too, about, you know, what we can do to be able to help minimize some of these threats and risks. So, and we would love to hear from some participants too about your questions regarding this. I know that the question of value has come up. You know, a lot of fellows have been listening and hearing that come up with various practitioners. And we see practitioners now having, you know, keeping our heads down and working on, you know, on Intel projects furiously in some cases. But it's important that we don't keep our sights down in the interim, you know, to all the points that have been made here, because when we do, we're going to miss developments and we're going to be missing some critical aspects that we need to have our sites trained on so we can become better advisors. So any other thoughts about this, about adapting, Parmalee?
Yes, Cynthia, go.
Years ago, I used to do a number of projects where we'd look at the financials of competitors and versus ourselves. And I think we're going to get back to that. I think we've already seen that some of the highly leveraged companies like the venture funded, like Hertz, gone because they don't have the margin. And so we're looking at the outside world again to say, what are they going to do? But again, what can they do? Now, we've seen a number of restaurants close. Well, I think many of those are closed by well-known chefs. When the economy picks up, they'll start another restaurant. But some of the other companies that are just too highly leveraged are not going to be able to do that. So I think it really depends. And also the financial impact of reopening is going to change the financial parameters in a lot of industries. If you're in real estate and you've office space and you've been sticking a lot of people into space and now you have to reconfigure everybody to be 6 feet apart, there's a whole value difference that I think we have to think about. So I think there's a lot of financial implications both for the short term and the long term, and rejiggering your business. I mean, the meat packing companies should not be operating the way they are. And that's workers side by side, not acceptable the way they're doing it. So I think we're going to see a lot of pressure to have businesses look at how they're treating their employees in terms of basic safety now. A lot of changes there, and a lot of them are uncertain, but I think the financial is going to become a more important part of what we're doing in terms of looking at ourselves and each industry.
Excellent point, Parmalee. And I'm really curious. I want to survey the fellows here, as well as the participants who are on this call, to see where you're at in terms of the type of research and analysis you're conducting. I take your point, Parmalee, and I think that when we're really looking at industries also, the industry dynamics being shifted. So something as fundamental as the 5 forces model, right? We're going, it requires revisiting, even at that basic level of our work. And you also have the financial piece, as you mentioned, but also trying to create frameworks where we can keep track of what's going on, not just in the operating environment, but also with all the macro environmental factors that are coming to bear as they evolve, and finding a way of working efficiently, cost effectively, right? And trying to understand how we might be able to produce our intelligence on an ongoing basis, so that we are capturing what it is that we should be, right? Without having to get down to reinventing everything and starting over, right? With the simple environmental scans and landscape analysis and so on and so forth. We've got to cobble this together. What are some of your recommendations about how practitioners can begin to understand some of this? Parmalee, you mentioned financial analysis. We just talked about industry analysis. What are some of the other ways that we might be able to do this so that we can manage our workflows, manage our sanity, right, while still trying to understand what is happening situationally and fulfill what our users need? Any thoughts on that?
I think one of the things to do is, once again, it goes back to the outset when you're starting a project. And I noted on your second bullet that you mentioned service and value, but I think the 2 most important words there are accuracy and speed. If it turns out that you and your client have a discussion around what he would like to have or she would like to have, and they make a laundry list of things that would normally take much longer than is going to be required to complete the work, there ought to be a discussion about what percentage of 100% of what they're looking for would be something they would be satisfied with. In other words, if it turned out that you could get 70% of what they want in the next 6 weeks because the decision is required, then the remaining 30% would be left to the client's, and this is a phrase that I've used over many years, seasoned executive judgment. That's what they're paid to do, okay? And some clients are very comfortable with the 30% level of my own experience, supplemented by 70% of data to support it, and analysis to support it. And others would say, keep going until you get 90%. Clients have a tendency, and Parmalee hit it on the head, to quantify things. They think about things in financial terms. And if you come at them with, what I normally give you, I'm not going to be able to give you, and you let them know that up front, then I think it will help when you get to the end. It's kind of like the old saying, start with the end in mind. Where are you going to be when you've got the answers they need? And if it's one intelligence topic that's dominant over all the others, just focus on one. And if you want to get 2 and you want to get 3, tell them how many can be achieved given the style and the sources and methods that you plan to use. And then they will have to rely a little bit more on their own judgment at the end in making the final decision.
Thank you. And I want to point out our attention to the chat as well. We've had some terrific insights here that folks are that the folks are bringing up. Jim Miller has mentioned that this is also going to be important to public affairs as well, to help shape government assistance programs. So yet another macro environmental factor there. And Richard Caldwell is paying attention to the post office hub for the region and seeing how busy that is, and the changes in supply chain assumptions being another area of opportunity. Chris Schroep, he says, a shift towards profitability, EPS, will be a focus as we transition. The last decade was invest for growth at all costs, and we are seeing how those costs are impacting the ability to adapt during disruption. And so, the way that we adjust from that, will be interesting as well. And we've seen this happen actually with the business community moving away, from the focus on shareholders, and even before this crisis had hit. So, so just to build off of Chris's point, And so we've got some really great thoughts here. So I encourage you to share this and share your observations about what you're seeing. And Luis, I don't know if you've been waiting patiently, because I know you had said something and then you didn't. So I want to make you have a chance to get
No problem. No. I would just like to build on top of what Brad and Clifford actually said. Brad actually kind of the point now is that we are starting from scratch. So everyone was affected, and we don't know where we are, and we don't know where we will be. So like CI is kind of more relevant than ever, because we really need to position ourselves, understand where we are again, and see where we are going. So that is like, there's no bigger opportunity for CI. And CI, futures foresight, whatever we want to call it, I think it always raises to the occasion in this kind of, when we have crisis. So I think the opportunity is there. But I think we also should focus our attention. So, and that kind of builds on what I would like to say, which is, as you know, I've been studying the definitions of competitive intelligence, and from around 400 papers that I've studied so far, I can tell you that only around, I think it's 3% mention the word consumer. So when everything on a company depends on our consumer or our customer, if we don't put it, and if this is not our focus, then we will be lost, whatever tool and analysis we use. Mm-hmm. And also on top of all of these, I think the companies now should be doing two things. The first one is monitoring kind of the situation, the closest to real time that we can do. And the second thing is kind of doing a scenario planning exercise for what will be the new normal. So like kind of 2-3 years from now. And again, starting with the end in mind, I think it was already said, we have to know where we are going, or at least have an understanding of what the future could hold. And then we monitor where we are going, and then kind of lead the way. I think that's the only way that we can, as CI professionals, help companies and also show our value.
Thanks, Luis. I love that you brought up the monitoring aspect as well, to add to this conversation. Because I think that I'm seeing a lot of folks monitor, but I'm not so sure that they have structured the monitoring activities for higher impact and higher insights, right? As a way to that, and so what would you and our fellows have to say about expanding that, to a more robust early warning system, right? Or incorporating that with some sort of an OODA, system, so that we're not just monitoring for monitoring's sake, because that's a very, very sort of deceptive activity, because it gives us the illusion that we are doing something, but we're not necessarily pulling the insights out in a more robust fashion, especially when we're time pressed, when we have cost restrictions and so on and so forth. And so what are your thoughts about adapting our monitoring so that it can be more robust for a time like this, so that it can create that situational analysis, as we're seeing new developments, and at the same time, it also feeds into a broader assessment, that can support strategic and tactical activities.
Mm-hmm. As you know, I've set up the SMINT, so the social market intelligence, which basically is competitive intelligence in real time. So if you do these, what happens is then when you have this capability in place, you are able to identify exactly those topics that you were mentioning, so the early signals, and you can build on those to then also do the scenario kind of exercise that I was talking about, because you'll be able to see kind of the bubbling kind of topics and signals, as I was saying, that can help you then have a kind of a view into the future. So if, again, you have to have that capability, as you said, because if you don't, now to set it up, it's a nightmare, together with all the things that are happening at the same time in our organization, the demands that you are, the ad hoc requests that you are being asked to reply, and so on and so forth. So as I started saying, so you have to have one monitoring, environmental scanning, if you want, what early warning opportunity system, whatever you want to call it, and then you have to have another thing, which is kind of seeing what is beyond the curve. And that's not easy if you don't have it. So you should have done scenario planning and be prepared for this kind of stuff, as Craig started to say. If you don't, now you have to recover that, and that's very hard to do in this specific situation when you are kind of being bombarded by a lot of requests and ad hoc requests and demands and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and this is where I do wonder, and not to drive too fine a point on it, but I do think there's something as simple, just as an example, as the UDA approach, and for folks who aren't familiar with it, it's OODA, observe, orient, decide, and act, and that doesn't necessarily require an establishment of a system, a formal system that that incorporates the technology and so forth, because much of it really is also just our own awareness and mindset. And so I think that beginning at least with that, that might be a good point for people who aren't quite there yet, so that you're not necessarily having to look at creating technical systems, or even systems that require multiple workflows, because it really just starts with us. And I sometimes I find that Intel pros aren't even using that, because they're still wedded to a more formal structure, right? Some of them are wedded to more of the key intelligence topics-based model. Others, might be still, something similar, where it's really more issue-based or focused on something that's well-defined, as opposed to complementing that, with a rapid development tool, a rapid assessment tool, like UDA or something modified along those lines, that require less investment, than it would be to create a system that requires people, technology, and processes and so forth. Any thoughts about that? How people might be able to make that adaptation so that they can incorporate some of these lower investment but high impact activities and models.
As you really well put it, UDA is done on an individual level, first and foremost. So this was for fighter pilots to orient themselves in air-to-air combat. I would say the challenge is that you're now competing on ecosystems. You are not just competing on a individually or more on a company by company level. So you are competing in the full ecosystem. And I would say this is a great start, but then you have to kind of coordinate all those OODA loops of all the people and all the departments. And what I really think is that is going to be the challenge. So how are you going to coordinate the new normal of marketing and consumer with the new normal of logistics and procurement, with the new normal of sales and digital channels, e-commerce? And so this, for me, I would say, is the biggest challenge of all, because we kind of do our own, even on an individual level, kind of a monitoring and OODA loop. We have our own OODA loops, and we do it as a process, even if we don't know about it. But the problem is to coordinate that. I think that is the really big challenge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I've so in the work that I've done, we've begun to work with some teams that are pulling this together, right? So that we have teams that are focused more on situational awareness, getting people just to talk, right? Just to communicate what they are seeing as a group, so that you can put this up to a higher level. So the point I'm making is that this doesn't have to be a tremendous investment, to develop, to expand situational awareness, to adapt, what we're doing, so that we can get away from the more defined, formal, project-based work and complement that with some more rapid action, types of activities as we go. So, anyone else have any thoughts about this, and how you're adapting your own practices for yourselves, perhaps some of our consultants on behalf of clients. Any thoughts about?
I think what I'm really noticing is that, can you hear me?
Yeah, if you can get a little
Yes.
closer to the mic, please.
Okay,
Ellen.
am I a little better now?
Much better, yeah.
Much better.
Yeah, this computer is a piece of junk. The first 30 seconds don't work and then it works. Anyway, what I'm really noticing is more than ever communication, and Cliff started with that, is number one right now. Communication on every level, clear communication, vulnerable communication. You don't have the answers. I'm living in uncertainty, but communication at all levels. And we're kind of talking about intelligence, often being outside of the company. You better be having good communication within your company. That's a competitive advantage right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't really touched on that. I'm getting more requests for elicitation training right now because people aren't good at communicating. They aren't good at getting people to share, or also sharing themselves. They're just not good at that. And they're realizing, oh, all these people are sitting at home working. What a great time to train, So I've kind of adapted my business to that, but I really feel like communication right now is so key. And also in your monitoring efforts, you need to include a lot more about the social, what's happening out there socially than was. Things around empathy, for your employees, things around the environment. It's much more than what pest used to be. We think of pest or steep. It's broadened. That macro environment has broadened because of this. And it's broadened, I think, for people to actually give more of a shit than they used to, because it's their employees, it's their livelihood, it's their survival for many companies. How are we going to reemerge? Are we even going to be able to reemerge? If we reemerge, how are we going to reemerge? For other companies, one I'm working with right now, they acquired another company. So as Rich was saying earlier on, there are opportunities out there too. It isn't all bad news, but it's mostly bad news.
Hey, I want to bring this back to Rich actually, because he just posted a comment that says, yes, with the lack of physical trade shows, you have to shift your thinking of how to collect primary intelligence.
Right.
Back to using the phone now more than ever. So let's turn it over to those of you who do phone work. So I think Parmalee, Ellen, and others. So what do you have to say about the work that you're doing right now, and how easy has it been for you to reach out and find folks? Parmalee, in monthly webinar for the fellows this month, you had some really interesting insights, from your practice, regarding the interviewing and human.
We used to catch people in, and we would figure out good times to call and say, hi, you have a couple minutes, and get 15 or 20 minutes. But they're not at their desk anymore, so you have to have a really good reason to set up a time with them now, as opposed to simply calling them, because they're at home and companies aren't necessarily, they haven't set up the lines to go directly to the home office. People are using their home phones or cell phones. So you can leave a message, but if you don't have a good reason for the person to call you back. So that's one of the big reasons, the big things that we have seen. So I think we're more inclined, excuse me, I just have to, just more inclined, if we're doing win-loss, can we use the client's name and just get more of a way, get more willingness to talk to us. So
can you speak to that a little bit more? I mean, this isn't, I don't do elicitation, the way you and Ellen do. And so can you speak a little bit more about how you are giving people reason, to call you back, to talk to you, right, to want to do that? What are some ways that you're, some new ways, novel ways, or perhaps even, ways that you've been using, to be able to elicit that response?
I'm not doing anything novel. I just have to do it a little better, which is, trading information figuring out
Yeah.
bits or something new, and basically saying, trading for, have one conversation with an industry observer, and then drop some hints in your message and get the person to call you back, and then you build on it, being very sensitive to what is sensitive to the individual. So you just have to do that better, is my feeling right now. I don't know if anybody else has any a difference, any
I
other.
think it's a really good point.
Yes.
In other words, when you contact somebody, it's not just for an interview. It's you want to be able to volunteer something during the conversation to help stimulate them to share and to exchange information. To me, that's much more important now. And I think it'll be a better way to engage than just to try to reach somebody and say, I want to interview you about something.
Yeah, I've noticed for the win-loss interviews that it's really hard to get people to agree to them. And you don't call them win-loss interviews. I never do. I refer to them in lots of different other ways. But
Yeah.
I feel like right now is not the right time to be conducting win-loss interviews when customers have told me, my clients have told me, we're having enough trouble staying in touch directly with our customers right now. And so, win-loss is a little less important to us right now. We just need to stay on top of that connection, i.e. to make the sale, to get it implemented, get it installed in the environment we're in. So I stopped doing win-loss. The last interview I had was on Friday, the 13th of March. It was a great interview, but I just thought this is great because we set it up before all this started. It was with a woman in Paris, and it went just fine. But I tried to have some other ones in Australia about a week or so later, and it was a very different experience. And so I basically went back to my client and said, listen, I got a one-liner back from one of your clients saying, I don't have time for this now. And part of that was in caps. And I sent it to her and just said, listen, you need to understand this is a different space. You need to have empathy for your clients, what they're going through right now. This is not a time for a win-loss call. And she pressed me on it though. And I said, you don't understand. This is a reflection of your company. It's not a reflection. It's not about me. I'm calling on behalf of your company. And I am feeling like I'm invading them right now because they're wounded. They're uncertain. They're unsure. They're whatever you want to say. This is not the right time. But I think other types of interviewing, as you were saying, Brad, are just fine, where you're actually reaching out to customers, finding out what's changing for them, what's happening now. Those kind of calls, those are just fine because they're direct connection. They're in the present tense, they're in the now, or they're in the slight, they're tactical, as Cliff was saying. They're reachy-outy, but they're direct and they're tactical, and there's something in it for the client right away to say, this is what's happening, how can you help me? Or, I just don't really know what to do. Those kind of calls, those are wide open still.
Yep.
Wide open and welcome.
And so I'd like to get back to what Richard Caldwell had mentioned about there now being a freeze on trade shows. So how are you helping your clients? How are you helping your companies develop that type of awareness of what's happening out there in the industry, is it competitive and a marketplace? What are the types of activities you're engaging in to be able to help them do that and to basically try to fill that gap as much as possible in the interim, given that we may not have trade shows in some sectors until next year, right?
Right. Yep.
Cynthia, why don't you bring Mr. Caldwell on to discuss that? He's a real expert.
Well, he's on another call right now.
Oh, Rich!
And he mentioned that he was actually doing double duty, so I didn't want to unmute him, and then that means that we're hearing his other.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So I do want to mention that. Yeah. So Rich, if when you are free, please let us know. But yeah, exactly. I would have muted him in a heartbeat.
Cynthia, I'll start with that. So one of the things we have to do to help them, in light of the fact that there probably won't be many, if any, physical trade shows and events over the next 6 months or so, you have to help them move their emphasis and their focus, by the way, whether they're communicating externally or whether we're actually, looking at things for them internally. You have to be able to utilize social media in some innovative ways to do that.
Right.
So social media in many respects, whether it's, engaging them and maybe some of the prospective clients that they would have been meeting at those shows. Maybe it's some of the speakers who would have been speaking at those shows, using things like panel sessions or webinars or, conversations like the one we're having here.
Right.
Those all become part of the, kind of go forward to at least keep the ball rolling, until or unless or whenever those shows are going to be held. And by the way, the vast majority of them are shifting over to some form of virtual presence. And so therefore, again, you're going to have to help them engage socially at that point in any respect.
Yep.
Those are excellent points. And we'll turn to Arik now for more insights.
I've been uncharacteristically quiet on this because I think a lot of the future is a lot different than we expect. About 2 months ago, I started circulating the Kubler-Ross grief cycle among the colleagues that Craig and I and Derek are working with to explain some of the psychology behind this. And you may have noticed that the state of Wisconsin had a political spat between the legislature and the governor, which was ultimately settled by our state Supreme Court, and thus making themselves irrelevant because they got stuck between anger and bargaining. They had no ability to move through depression to testing and eventually acceptance. And I see that's where we are right now as sort of Wisconsin, the place where I live, Georgia, the place where Craig lives, and the United States, the place where many of us live, but at least being the exception there. I think we're seeing a lot of that sentiment play out. And that's actually the primary metric that I've started looking at the last several weeks as we've been hosting webinars. 70 days ago, we started doing webinars in support of this, and I've done 70 webinars in the last 70 days on the topic. And the last several have been longitudinally comparing sentiment around 3 primary clusters of expectations. One is consumer demand. When will your household's consumer demand return to something that looks like what it used to? And that's not a very hopeful picture. The second is employment and sort of the job situation, also not very hopeful. The estimate that I saw a few weeks ago out of the Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago was 42.5% of the jobs that have been lost here in the United States in the last 60 days are never coming back. So that fundamentally changes the economic assumptions under which all of our businesses are operating. Then the third metric, is really around financial performance, expectations of financial performance, and some return to that semblance of the past. That's actually the most optimistic one out of the 3, is that companies understand that there is a creative destruction process afoot right now, and that creative destruction process forces them to get through depression to testing right now. If they aren't to testing by now, it may be too late. And I'm reminded of the old Jack Welch quote when he was CEO of General Electric: if change is happening faster on the outside than it is on the inside, then the end is near. And I'm afraid that is very true for so many of the companies that we used to serve, and they're just not going to make it. And I think, Luis, I saw you were putting some winners, losers, and in-betweens up in the chat a few minutes ago. I don't see travel and tourism and hospitality ever returning to what it was. And a lot of that's because of the fundamental economics of business travel. If you think about consumer travel, vacations, and so on, the underlying cost structure of the travel and tourism sector globally was underwritten by business travel. We've just proven in the last 75 days that we don't need to do that anymore.
Right.
So what happens when your plane ticket to Beijing someday is $8,000 instead of $800? Will you go?
Yeah.
No, you won't go. So that's, I think, the thing that we're missing. And the term I use, at least here at Aurora and with clients, is the stochasm. The difference between what we think we know and what we actually know is much, much bigger than any of us understand on this conversation right now. And that's why I've been so quiet for the last 50 minutes or so. So that's my primary contribution to this conversation is I'm not scared. I'm actually very enterprising about the whole thing. I think there is the potential for one of the greatest booms of personal productivity our global economy has ever seen. And as you see the reintegration of supply chains locally and the consummate cost structure that will, of course, accompany that, you're going to see a tremendous amount of economic potential flower, but not until we get through depression to testing and eventually acceptance in the grief cycle.
Right.
Fantastic. Thanks. It's almost I almost feel like this should be the capstone point in our discussion, but we do have some good time left. Any thoughts about what Arik has said, either from our participants here as well as our panelists? Anyone want to?
This is Cliff. I just wanted to jump in on one of the things
Yeah, Cliff, can you get closer to the mic, please?
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Now you're good.
Yeah, this is very narrowly focused as opposed to being focused on a number of industries, which is what everyone else has talked about. But it's relevant to all industries in the sense that it's an element that I hear from my clients probably more than anything else. And that's the issue of vaccine development. Every client I speak to, or every client that's in another industry which is not familiar with the pharmaceutical business or the biotechnology industry, has an operating assumption that what they hear in the press, when a vaccine will be available and this will all go away, is true. Well, it isn't true, okay? It's going to take longer than people think.
Yeah.
The concept of a 12 to 18 round for a vaccine is fantasy. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to be with it a little bit longer than people think, just because this is a very tough virus. And a lot of people are working on it with a lot of new technologies that are unproven. If you've just seen the reaction, for instance, over the past couple of weeks to the entire stock market when it's announced that 8 people got some neutralizing antibodies from the injection of a virus that was given using a technique that has never produced a vaccine that's been approved by any government. It gives you a sense of reality versus kind of what the stoicism that Arik was talking about. So I think at the end of the day, there's a realistic side to this from the health industry's perspective that can be communicated by those that know the facts. And frankly, it's the medical people and the scientific people that you have to rely on.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see.
Yes, go ahead.
One of the ways in which organizations are going to react to this is more automation. If people spread disease to each other, let's automate. And we're going to have another huge issue with automation taking jobs away. I mean, this whole thing with jobs moving to China and Mexico was garbage. 80 to 90% of those jobs that disappeared in the United States in the past, 30 plus years were lost to automation. And right now I could just see a huge push for more automation in industries. A robot, and now, you go into, I've been in like Friendlies and you order you order everything and pay on a little iPad on the table. Well, that takes one wipe. All the human has to do is deliver the food to you. Now they're talking about robots to do that. So that's just a simple example, but I can really see that there'd be another push for automation. And then we're going to have another whole issue with the people. What are you going to do with people who are not going to adapt well to that? I mean, it'll take a long time for this productivity push through automation to be big enough to really take in and help so many of the people that we have in the United States. I mean, right now, you look at the meat processing plants, they are just getting hammered on the fact that they have very unsafe environments because they've had very cheap labor immigrant labor. And so they're going to probably start changing it. That's another place to invest in automation. So I can go on example, but I see some faces that say, yep. And so that's going to be another, we already have big problems with income inequality here. I can see that as exacerbating it.
Yeah, as we've been seeing, I think in a number of headlines, particularly in this country, less so in some others, is that this pandemic has really accelerated in a lot of the inevitable changes that's to come. And I think that Arik has nailed it in talking about the travel industry and so forth. And so I think that, and there are other industries as well. And so I think it's particularly important for us to focus on how this is going to come to bear on our industry, our suppliers, right, and all along the distribution chain, especially if we have B2B of models. And so I think that if we're not doing it now as practitioners, we need to be paying attention to this. This is the type of exercise that we need to be running as Intel practitioners. And so I'm looking at the time, we've got about 5 more minutes as we wind down. So anyone have any burning comments, questions that you want to ask, to be sure that you get that in. I do want to note that Jonathan has asked Arik, what is the biggest change for you? What's pushed you over the edge on
that? I'm not sure I quite understand the question. I think he's referring to my chat remark about my demand will never return to what it was. I had a great conversation.
He says, I'm sorry, he says on consumption.
Yeah, so I think I had a great conversation this morning with an old mutual friend of Craig and mine from a local restaurant chain based here in Wisconsin called Culver's. Culver's does these great things called butter burgers and frozen custard and cheese curds, and they're just wonderful. And I talked with him a little bit about how my family of 6 used to eat at Culver's on average 2.5 times a week. I have no plans to return to Culver's until we understand the immunology behind the coronavirus that causes COVID-19. To Cliff's point, we don't understand the epidemiology. We don't understand what antibodies represent. We don't understand. I talked to one epidemiologist weeks ago who said maybe this is like dengue fever, where the first time you get it, you feel kind of crappy, and the second time you get it, you bleed from every orifice until you die. We don't know. We don't know. And so until we find out, my consumer demand for my household will never return to what it was. And of course, my friend at Culver's was quite disconcerted by this notion that my 2.5, 6-person meals will never be returning. I said, you guys got to figure this out. That's your new normal. Is exactly how are you going to guarantee that I am not going to cart this home to my son with asthma and my wife with asthma who may not live through this? I might be fine, by the way. I'm pretty healthy, spry for my age, whatnot. But that doesn't take into account the voluntary surrender of some of our old expectations to help those that are more vulnerable than we are. And that's really the bottom line, I think, for me and for all of us, is this has caused us all to reassess what our expectations were about our lifestyle. I personally love it. I'm having a great time. I love this, coronavirus pandemic lifestyle. I think it's great, but I'm not very popular around my house where my wife is leading the Little Red Schoolhouse every day, and I don't have to. So,
yeah, fair enough. And
Arik.
So folks who are signing off right now, and so I just, as we wind down, I want to mention that we've got some programs coming up. The CI Fellows Mentorship Program is launching, so stay tuned for the announcement next week. We also have the CI Community of Practice on Slack that's coming soon as well. That will be a complement for this, and because we will be moving and talking about other topics, from month to month, not simply focused on a change and uncertainty and the pandemic. And so this community of practice, we can basically take these conversations and bring it there and do it on an ongoing basis rather than waiting on a monthly basis to meet. So please stay tuned for that as well. And we'll be rolling out our interview series in honor of our 30th celebration of our first fellows throughout the year. And then in September, we've got coming up with the virtual summit series. We'll be doing a deep dive on a topic. So with that, thank you so much for a terrific conversation. Craig and I were talking about this actually before this session, that the importance of these webinars isn't simply for idea exchange, but it's also really great to get together, that the challenges that we have. We have folks who get the pressures, that we are experiencing through this as Intel practitioners, and so I'm really proud that we're supportive of this as well, and so I really do appreciate all that you've all brought into this. And then finally, our next webinar is June 24th. So just please keep in mind that our webinars tend to be the last Wednesday of every month. So put that into your calendars. And on June 24th, we'll be featuring Mark Chussell. So he'll be talking about strategy and technology in the context of this. And then stay in touch in the various ways. Mentorship emails right there if you're interested in being a mentor or mentee. We're just wanting to learn more. And then we've got our newsletter, so you can stay in the loop, in terms of our announcements and new developments. And we have our recordings available on our website and also on YouTube. And just stay in touch via Twitter, as well as our LinkedIn community group. So I want to thank our panelists very much. I'm just, you know how much I think of you as colleagues, but I'm also just really proud of what we can do for our practice community here, month to month and in between via these webinars and other activities. So thank you so much for sharing your insights. I look forward to your doing this in our various channels, and so everyone. Stay well, be safe, and let's keep listening to those experts with the real insights and data and evidence. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
And have a good